Story 1. After my grandfather on my mother's side passed away, my mom, her sister, and my two uncles pieced together a bit of family history, wherein they came to the conclusion that my grandfather murdered a child molester who was eyeing my aunt, who was the baby of the family at the time, only 6 or 7 years old, on school grounds and trying to get her into his car on multiple occasions. My grandfather drove her to school one day, it was a Friday, and asked her to point out the man who had been doing this. She did, and that weekend, my grandfather and a close family friend organized a little getaway for the family, up the coast to the beach. This was very random. At a rest stop for gas and snacks, my uncles, aged 8 and 10 to 11, saw a bundle under their seat in the back, and when they unrolled it, they found a machete covered in viscera. My younger uncle didn't understand what he was seeing, but the older one knew it was some dangerous adult business and wrapped it back up, making him swear not to say anything. They got to the beach late Saturday, and before anyone got out, my grandfather and the family friend had to do something first. They grabbed a big carpet roll out of the trunk, took the bundle from under the seat, and carried it up the shoreline, past the rocks and such. A while later, they came back, took the family to a hotel for the night, and spent most of Sunday having fun at the beach. As adults now, my mom and her siblings were shocked, each contributing some small piece to this whole story, never knowing about the entire situation until then. Finally, my grandmother chimed in and said that my grandfather was not a man who trusted the police to do anything about anything and just shrugged. I only really feel comfortable telling this now as both grandparents, my aunt, and my mom have all passed away. Only my uncles are still alive. Story 2. My grandmother's birthday was on October 30th. When she died, we learned it was actually on October 31st. She refused to acknowledge that she was born on Halloween. Story 3. My biological grandfather assaulted my mother multiple times when she was a teenager. He encouraged my uncle to do the same. A few years ago, it was revealed that my uncle assaulted and harmed my aunt, who is his sister, while they were growing up. My grandmother was aware of everything at the time and did not care. I do not know if there are more confessions because I cut off contact with all of them years ago. Story 4. My dad learned as an adult that his father, who he had known as his dad his entire life, was not his biological father. But that is not the surprising part. After my grandmother died, my dad asked me to see if I could find any information about his biological father online. I entered a few details into Ancestry and very quickly found a marriage certificate showing a marriage that occurred before my grandfather. Then I found another. Then another. My grandmother had been married not once before, but 3 times before she eventually married my grandfather. And she had kept them all secret. We do not even think my grandfather knew about the first 2. This all took place in the 1940s, spanning several states, and we were not able to find divorce paperwork for all of them, so it is quite possible she was legally married to several people. Story 5. I had an aunt on my dad's side who became severely cognitively impaired as a child, supposedly due to a mosquito bite. She was placed in a care facility, and no one ever seemed to visit her or acknowledge her. I think my mom did once give my grandmother a ride there to let her visit. She actually passed away shortly after my grandparents did of natural causes. Story 6. My great-aunt was raped, and she was forced to marry her rapist. They had 2 children together and stayed married until the day he died. Story 7. My grandma hastened my grandpa's death because she was done taking care of him. This wasn't a compassionate shuffle of the mortal coil, but a greedy one. It wasn't a deathbed confession, but more of a known secret that we didn't talk about. Story 8. An American uncle had a secret family in Kenya. Years later, he started a family with his secret daughter and thought no one would reveal the truth. Then my cousin came to Australia and told everybody. It was quite surprising. Story 9. My dad used to take me to an old veterans bar when I was a kid. Some of the other members would bring their kids and grandkids as well, and I would play with one of them in particular because my dad always talked to his mom. One day, my dad got pretty drunk there and pulled me to the side. He leaned in and pointed to the kid. He told me that the other kid was my brother. I asked what he meant, and he seemed to realize he shouldn't have said anything and concluded that he just was. This was 20-something years ago. I'm pretty sure my mom knows my dad cheated, but not the extent of having another child. I also don't think he remembers telling me. I know nothing about that child and couldn't even recall his name. My parents are currently the happiest I've ever seen them recently, and I don't want to bring anything up that might disrupt that because they had some rough years. So, for the time being, the only other person that knows is my wife and an online forum. Story 10. Grandpa was an abuser. In the family, only my mom, who was a victim, and my grandmother knew. My grandmother relied on my grandfather as a source of income. So like any good Christian woman, she stayed quiet and subservient. My mother was bullied by both grandparents to remain silent and was shamed appropriately. The moment both grandparents passed away, my mom was eager to reveal that secret. In hindsight, it definitely explains, 1, why my mom was more cautious about my sister and me being around our grandparents when we were younger, and 2, why my grandfather treated us poorly compared to the other grandchildren. When the secret came out, there was a 50% disappointment that my grandfather wasn't the good man they thought he was, and 50% who doubted my mom's story and reacted similarly to my grandmother. Nasty abusers. Story 11. My dad ran over my grandfather's prized rose bushes that won awards at the county fair when my dad was in college. My dad finally broke the news when my grandfather was in home hospice. Story 12. We were going through photo albums for my grandfather's obituary, and we found some pictures of my mom in a wedding dress. That should have been the first red flag. My mother had described her wedding dress to me in detail before. My mom told them to close the album and look through the others, but she refused to tell me why. She said she would tell me after we got back to where we lived. When we did, I will never forget the words that left her mouth. Those pictures were from my first marriage. Don't tell your brother. Story 13. We found out my grandpa was gay after he passed away last year. There was tons of evidence. I guess my sister knew, and he asked her to keep it a secret from us. He was married to my grandma for 62 years, and she passed away a month before he did. Nobody ever knew. Story 14. I found out who my true grandfather was at 65. My dad never knew that his dad was not his biological father. The whole family was shocked to find out through Ancestry and 23andMe. I had some cousins test as well. It was a big shock. Story 15. Nothing really that bad, just some moonshining in the 1960s that led to a fiery car crash, killing a couple of cousins. For a long time, my grandma claimed they had died overseas. Story 16. You know how some people's family trees can be considered a wreath? Yes, mine is more of a tumbleweed. Story 17. I'm the secret keeper. My older brother molested me when I was a child, with a 5-year age gap. My parents have no idea, and I do not plan to tell them. My mother was molested by her older brother, and the thought that it happened to me, after she worked so hard to prevent it, would break her. Story 18. Since I asked, I might as well answer. My paternal great-great-grandfather paid for my great-grandmother and her family to be murdered so he could take the kids, my grandfather and his 3 sisters. He came from a wealthy family, and my great-grandmother did not. So it turned into basically a blood war to kidnap the children. Well, it turns out the man my great-great-grandfather paid was a friend of my great-grandmother and her family. He informed them about the plans to have them murdered and take the children. As a result, they were able to leave overnight and escape without a trace. They went into hiding until my great-great-grandfather died, and they were finally able to reunite with my great-grandfather. But by this time, the kids were older and had little to no relationship with him, and the relationship they did have was incredibly hostile. My grandfather moved to the United States when he was an early teenager with his sisters and my great-grandmother, primarily to get away from my great-grandfather, but that did not really work since he ended up following them. My father and his siblings ended up having a relationship with my great-grandfather that was not well received by my grandfather, but my great-grandfather insisted. Despite everything, my great-grandfather never had any other children and left all of the family money, land, and other assets to my grandfather, being the only son. My grandfather did not want anything to do with it and sold it off. We are like 99% sure it went to the cartel in Mexico because the deal was very shady, and we were pretty sure the land was already being used as a cover for the cartel anyway. My grandfather is also very secretive about how he has accumulated so much wealth in his life. I am sure he will take that to his deathbed. Story 19. My biological grandfather assaulted and tortured my uncle, who was under 9 years old, in the 1970s, and my grandmother left him. I had known this part, but I found out last week that while drinking at his home, my grandmother went back to him and stayed, knowing what was happening to her son, and it continued to happen for years. He received 10 years in prison and he died after 6. I cannot look at my grandmother the same way. Story 20. Not really dark, but definitely a secret. After my dad died, I was doing some genealogy and discovered that his grandparents, my great-grandparents, got married in November and had their first child the following February. That child then unfortunately died 6 months later, and a year later my grandfather was born. I spoke to my uncle about this, and he knew nothing about any of this. My grandfather never spoke about it, or more likely, he was never told he had an older sister who died and was raised to believe he was the eldest. Story 21. Older cousin molested several of us. We just found out that we all thought we were the only ones. I turned 60 this year. There is a lot to process. Story 22. My mother's parents died when she was around 3. She and her siblings were split up. The oldest was adopted by a family, the middle child was adopted by their uncle and his wife, and my mother was fostered by an Amish family. Eventually, the uncle and his wife adopted my mother as well a few years later. My mother had my brother at 16 and me at 19. As a child, I can remember her uncle, whom we referred to as our grandfather, visiting us weekly, although he and his wife lived 40 minutes away. He only visited when my stepfather was at work, and we would always be ushered outside while the door was locked. Many years later, when we were adults, my brother got into a fistfight with our uncle, who was the son of our grandfather. It happened because he revealed that our grandfather was actually my brother's father. Suddenly, so many things made sense in my mind. I cut that entire side of my family out of my life. I have never asked my mother about it. Story 23. My great-grandfather likely experienced some difficult events during World War II. When he came back, he obsessively washed his hands several times a day. That's all we ever got to know. And yes, I am from Germany. Story 24. My great-grandfather was in his 40s when he married my great-grandmother, who was 12. We always knew she was young, but the actual age was discovered through census records. Some people in the family still do not believe it, but since then, other records have confirmed it. Story 25. My grandfather was a pedophile and molested his biological daughter, my mother, starting when she was a young girl. This continued into her marriage to my father and resulted in her using illicit drugs as a coping mechanism. I am not sure if it was the drugs or if she was just tired of dealing with the demons this caused, but she ended up committing suicide in front of me at age 4. My grandfather, worried that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation would discover the root cause of her suicide, tried to convince law enforcement that it was not suicide and that I had murdered my mother. Thankfully, forensic testing confirmed the cause of death as suicide. To make matters worse, my 2 younger sisters and I ended up living with him after my father's death. True to form, he began molesting one of my sisters shortly after we had moved in. I did not realize at the time that my grandfather was a pedophile and had no idea my sister was being molested. She told me about it years later after he had already passed. It was at this point I began looking into our family secrets. I learned my grandfather had raised another set of grandchildren before us and had molested one of the girls then too. The entire family apparently knew about the situation and chose not to notify authorities or take any action to help the children. I suspect they also knew he was molesting my sister for several years while we lived with him. Story 26. My grandfather and his brother-in-law killed a child molester back in the late 1960s. My grandmother told me a few years after he died. I never put much stock in the story, as my grandmother had a habit of telling tall tales. I asked my mom about it and she freaked out. She locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days. Once she came out, she acted like nothing had happened. Story 27. We found out a few years ago that our grandfather didn't just pass away from an illness back in the 1960s when my dad was 2 years old. He committed suicide due to depression. It was quite a shock. Story 28. My family used to be pretty prestigious. They only married within certain noble families. Unfortunately, that led to a lot of poor health in the descendants, and eventually my great-grandfather and grandfather realized we were too sickly and unattractive. So for the future of the family, he started adopting a lot of children who looked healthy and good-looking, passing them off as the children of his wives and mistresses. They would go straight to parents and ask for their kids, and a lot of the time the parents handed them over because they thought they could provide a better life. He also adopted the children of people who tried to kill him, thinking it was funny that the children of his enemies would grow up loving him. My dad told me this when I asked why nobody wanted to get genetic testing to narrow down what caused the family blindness. It turns out they are all worried the tests would prove they aren't related to me, when it's obvious due to my health issues that my lineage is without question. So I got the unattractive, inbred, blue blood genes. Story 29. I have a couple of stories to share. First, my mom gave a baby up for adoption when she was 17 and never told us, her children. My brother was snooping once and found the adoption papers. I found my sister, and now my mom and she are close. My mom planned to take that to her grave, and it brings lots of guilt and shame. I was 41 when I learned about this. Second, my paternal grandfather had a whole family, including a wife and 5 kids, that he just walked out on one day. He divorced his wife and then, at 34, met my grandmother, who was 17. He married her and had 5 kids with her. After my grandfather died, my dad found his half-siblings, and we met them. Nobody keeps in touch anymore. Story 30. I had a great aunt who was a widow 3 separate times. Everyone said it was very sad and unfortunate, and that she stopped marrying in fear that it would happen again. When she died, one of our family members looked more into the deaths of her husbands. They found it strange that all of them died from natural causes despite being too young for that. It is not like natural causes cannot happen at 30 to 40, but it is strange that it happened 3 separate times. The more they investigated, the more they started to realize that all of these deaths were not accidental. I cannot remember how they figured it out, but we learned that she had poisoned all of them and nobody knew. She had played innocent the entire time, and she was never investigated because nobody thought the deaths were homicide. So now everyone in my family knows her as a Black Widow, and it is easily the darkest secret we have. We have another secret, but it is less dark and more crazy, and I cannot share it. Story 31. When she was dying, my great-grandmother confessed to my grandmother that she was the reason great-grandpa died at 48 years old. The doctor blamed it on a heart attack brought on by heat stroke and the malaria he had contracted as a younger man. Great-grandma said that the morning of his heart attack, he had been irritable with her, so she put rat poison in his coffee cup. She thought better of it and dumped it out before serving him coffee that morning, but she didn't wash it out and, well, it doesn't take a whole lot of arsenic to kill a man who already has malaria. Bonus story. Not a deathbed confession, but when I was about 11, we found out that my dad, who had always been an only child due to my grandmother having a hysterectomy shortly after she married my grandpa, had a story about a crazy murderous great-grandma telling my grandmother she would put both my dad and my aunt in the ground if she didn't give my aunt up. Important note, Grandpa is her second husband, and the first marriage was supposedly to my dad's biological father, which ended because her first husband didn't want kids, and apparently didn't know how sex worked. Well, our aunt showed up, and my wonderful and understanding grandfather accepted her immediately while saying, "I always wanted a daughter." And you would think that level of honest, unconditional love would encourage a loosening of the tongue, but Grandma didn't say anything further. My aunt is 3 years younger than my dad. Grandpa married Grandma when my dad was 6. When I was around 20, an uncle who is a year older than my dad showed up, and I don't know what the story was because that uncle had problems, so he wasn't welcomed like my aunt. However, Grandpa still loved her and forgave her for the secret. Grandma could have taken this moment to say something, but Grandma and Grandpa both died during the pandemic, and that's when Uncle number 2 showed up, 1.5 years younger than my dad and 1.5 years older than my aunt, almost to the day. But wait, there's more. When he married Grandma, Grandpa was working for a company that had him traveling a lot, so he was rarely home until after that big medical scare that resulted in Grandma's hysterectomy before they ever had a chance to start a family of their own. The hysterectomy's name is Paul, the final uncle to show up, And we only know that he was the hysterectomy baby because his birthday is 2 days before her discharge paperwork, which she kept in a box of important documents and from Paul himself. He waited until Grandpa's death to reveal himself, but he had been a member of Grandma and Grandpa's church and a family friend for a few decades. Grandma cheated on Grandpa while he was traveling and became pregnant. That poor man never would have done the math and realized he hadn't been home for conception, but Grandma wanted to protect herself. She went to a local doctor and his wife, who had been having very public troubles conceiving, and made an offer. If he would state she had some sort of medical reason and perform a hysterectomy when she went into labor, they could keep the baby. My dad was a single child with 4 siblings. Story 32. Grandfather and grandmother separated. Grandfather dated another woman. They ended their relationship. That woman fell in love with someone else. Grandfather shot that person with a shotgun in a fit of jealousy. Story 33. I just learned this in December. During World War II, my great-grandfather, who died before I was born, likely helped Nazis land successfully in Florida. He was put on trial for it, but was never convicted because they did not have enough evidence. Apparently, my whole family is 100% sure he did it. He sent my grandfather, his son, to Germany as a teenager to attend a military school there, no doubt hoping that my grandfather would come back with different beliefs. He even met Adolf Hitler once while he was in training there. He came back to the United States after only a few months because he did not like it. My grandfather fought in World War II on the United States side and was also put on trial for being a potential spy due to his time in the German training camp, but thankfully was not convicted because he was innocent. Kind of a wild thing to know that if he had been wrongly convicted, I would not exist. Story 34. My grandfather owned a taxi business that was a money laundering front and was used to move bodies for the mob back in the 1970s and 1980s. There is much more that I won't include. I am only comfortable saying this because it has been over for a while now and my grandfather did his time, which was unrelated to the taxi business, and he has been gone for a number of years. Story 35. One of my siblings and a cousin used to engage in sexual behavior when they were kids. No one knew about it until they grew up and trauma traits started showing. It ripped my family in half. Story 36. My uncle, who is my father's brother, molested my aunt, who is my uncle and father's half-sister. My father chose to shame my aunt and said she was making it up for attention. She was the youngest sibling, and it happened to her at a very young age. That uncle is now deceased, and I have no contact with my father because of his abusive nature and hatred towards women. He has major issues with women and blames them anytime a man does something bad to them. They always deserve it somehow. Story 37. My dad hit someone walking on the side of the road during a snowstorm. He did not kill them, but I think he injured them pretty significantly. I do not know the details, but he made payments to this woman monthly for a long time. He is dead now, and I have no contact with his wife. My husband and I could never find anything about an arrest or court case, so I am assuming it was blackmail because my dad was not a nice enough person to do it out of guilt. Story 38. My dad murdered his nephew when I was a teenager for reasons I will never be privy to. Dad was also a rapist and pedophile who groomed my mom from the age of 15 when he was 30. She had multiple children with him, being pregnant at 18, and suffered years of physical and mental abuse, as did my siblings and I, while living in that toxic household. It turns out my mom's older brothers had been molested by another male family member, which led him to molest my mom. She has her demons as a result. He was friends with my dad, and that is how my dad was introduced to my mom. I have years of childhood trauma from growing up with a paranoid schizophrenic dad and a shell of a mother who found it hard to walk away. This is only the beginning. I could write a book about my perspective as the oldest child in a toxic environment. Story 39. I have 2 stories to share. First, my grandfather robbed a small bank in the early 1950s twice. He was eventually caught and had to pay all the money back. Second, the same grandfather fathered a child, my aunt, whom we did not know about. I got a surprise when I discovered I had a mystery aunt well into my 30s. Please note that my grandfather is deceased and had a difficult personality. Story 40. My grandmother dated a federally watched and wanted drug lord. In her late 60s, she dated Bud. He was a large man who bragged about being in Jimmy Hoffa's crew the day he disappeared. My grandmother is retired, living on a pension, nothing special, and starts dating this guy in Waveland, Mississippi. One day she walks in and sees him standing there with this open suitcase of cocaine or heroin or something, and he just beats her badly, putting her in the hospital. When my mom, her sister, and my dad go to the locals, they don't know his actual name but know his address, and he's Bud. Local police look up a few things to figure out who this is, and they describe him based on the information on the screen. Within a few minutes, a supervisor comes in saying they can't be there and can't be talking about this guy. But the initial officer is shocked that someone like this is in their jurisdiction. Dad works with a retired Secret Service agent and asks if he can make a phone call to find out who this guy is and what he's up to. 2 days later, a pair of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents walk into my dad's office to ask why he's asking about Bud. They tell Dad not to involve himself or pursue it any further. Bud died about 2 years later, and my grandmother 3 years later. We still don't know who he was or the scope of what was going on around us. Story 41. Mom and Dad did the genetic match thing. I do not know if it was 23andMe or one of the others. Years later, my mom got an email out of the blue. A young woman said she had grown up in foster care after having never known her dad and being taken from her drug-addicted mom. She was now happily married with 2 daughters of her own and wanted to find her dad. So she did the same service and got a near match in my mom. I do not recall the details, but basically, her dad had to be a nephew of my mom or something close to that. Well, there was only one male in my mom's family that was the right age. Deciding that it was not her secret to keep, my mom told the woman about her nephew, my cousin. It turns out that while he was engaged to his current wife, he had been involved with another woman. It eventually came out that he had known he had gotten her pregnant. It was not a one-night stand and had immediately bailed. He refuses to this day to acknowledge her. His wife stood by him, but the real kicker. About a year after the revelation, the cousin's daughter got married. My dad had just started to get sick, so he and my mom could not come, so I flew from California to Ohio, and my sister flew from Maryland to attend and represent our family. You know how traditionally you invite out-of-town relatives to attend things like the rehearsal dinner? Yes, we were basically persona non grata because my dear cousin and his wife were absolutely terrified we would reveal their big secret, which they were keeping from their kids. They were dead wrong. We had both agreed that we were not going to be those kinds of people who ruin this other person's wedding, but of course there could not be an actual discussion about it. Fast forward another few years, and the daughter who had gotten married called my mom. She and my mom had always been close, but she was absolutely livid because she had just found out about this other person out there claiming to be her half-sister, and that my mom had apparently been the one to start the rumors about her dad. Of course, what had really happened is that she had learned the truth. But to this day, this call was now 4 to 5 years ago. She has not spoken to my mom again. And the real surprising and not surprising bit? The cousin, the dad in all of this, is the most virulently racist person I know. I am sure it will be a shock to learn that a white guy who grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio could have possibly turned out that way. But if you are following along, you already know the punchline. The daughter he refuses to acknowledge is black. The good news is that I got a very cool new family member out of this. She is awesome, way better than any of the kids my cousin had a hand in raising, and she has a daughter who is precisely, to the day, the same age as my son. Story 42. My mother was engaged to someone else before she married my dad. Her parents even got her silver engraved with his last initials. Then she married my dad. I always wondered why our family silver had a V on it. She took that secret to her grave. We found an engagement notice and some photos but never learned anything else about him. Story 43. Not a deathbed confession, but my mother-in-law shared with me that a family friend molested her, and she told her mother and nothing came of it. Her parents stayed friends with the man and his wife and kept a picture of them in the house. She swore me to secrecy, and I haven't said anything to my husband because it would change the way he remembers his grandmother. I may tell him once my mother-in-law passes away. Should I? Story 44. None really, except we haven't told our youngest, who is 8 years old, that her brother died because he intentionally wrecked. She thinks it was an accident. We don't know how to explain the truth to her right now, and we think it would mess her up more than she already is, dealing with the trauma from the 7 weeks before he died from his injuries. I dread telling her the truth and don't really know when or how it should be done, but I know it must be done, and we will. Story 45. When my white grandmother was in elementary school in Alabama, she would walk home from school alongside her 3 friends. They would titter and gossip the whole way down the country dirt road. I do not know what age they were. I am guessing around 3rd or 4th grade. The janitor of the school was a very jovial black man. He would often joke and wave to the children as he did his job in the school, and the kids always loved him. One day, on their usual walk home from school, the janitor jumped out from a bush and said, "Boo!" The 4 girls screamed in happy excitement and ran all the way home. When my grandmother ran into the house, her grandfather was there, immediately asking why she had run home instead of walking, as she usually did. My grandmother said something to the effect of, "The janitor scared us on our way home." Her grandfather took this to mean something rather more serious than it actually was. My grandmother says that he left immediately, and he did not get back until dinner. Nothing about it was discussed. The next few school days, the janitor was absent. Finally, a week or 2 later, he was back on the job. He now had a permanent limp. My grandmother said that she never saw him smile at the kids ever again. Story 46. We are pretty sure my grandmother murdered her first husband. The second one killed himself. The third one drank himself to death but gave her a run for her money. Story 47. Not my direct family, but my wife's. This is in no way comparable to the gut-wrenching other stories in here. I just found my wife's grandfather's story interesting. He confessed to him and another man killing a revenue agent back in the 1940s. I have no proof of this other than the few folks who were with him when he passed. He was a wild man growing up, getting into fights constantly. He took up boxing so he could hurt them quicker. He got upset when the government required driver's licenses. He made moonshine, which led to the revenue agent going missing. The man eventually turned his life over to God and became a preacher. 2 different men from what I am told. One a crazy lunatic, the other a nice, sweet, humble man. I never got to meet him before I met my wife. He passed in the late 1990s. When his confession comes up, her family says, "Yeah, that was Joe's crazy days." Not one of them was surprised when they heard it. Story 48. My dad accidentally fathered dozens to hundreds of surrogate children. He was deployed overseas in the United States Air Force when his wife at the time went nuts and left my 2 older brothers by themselves, abandoning them. She was not paying bills, and my dad had to make extra money to survive. Luckily, his neighbor at the time was a nurse at a fertility clinic. He only donated for long enough to make ends meet, but unknown to him, the profile of him being a United States Air Force captain, a Mensa member, having several college degrees, and being good-looking led many couples to choose his samples. So far, only one of my surrogate siblings has reached out, but my father passed away over a decade ago. My uncle actually sent my mom a cease and desist letter using his own law firm's letterhead to request that she never speak of this to my grandma because it deeply upset her to learn her son donated to a sperm bank and bore children outside of wedlock. She is now a big part of our family, and I am actually going to meet her for the first time tomorrow. Honestly, I hope to someday meet more of my surrogate brothers and sisters. A lot of them may never know or even care, but I think it's kind of crazy and cool. Story 49. When I was 13, I came home drunk and went straight to my mother's journal for a reason that eludes me until this day. I read that she wished my dad would cheat on her, so she had a reason to leave. I lived with that for 8 years when, finally, my sister told me while drinking that she had caught our dad cheating on our mom when I was around 14. However, she never told our mom or anyone. She only confronted our dad to stop the affair, as she knew our mom would take us away from him. I then heard about their diary. We have never really spoken about it since. It has been another 8 years. Story 50. I recently learned that Grandpa, who served in World War II, received a Purple Heart on the European front. He may have been a United States interrogator on United States soil. He spoke fluent German, and when he came back from Europe due to injuries, he served as an interrogator somewhere on the East Coast. It was all top secret, and I can't find information on it. I can't remember what the type of his unit was called, something related to the East Coast area, boys. Obviously, it's not a dark secret, but it proves Grandpa could hold one. If you really need a secret, the same Grandpa got drunk at a family party and exposed his racism. That's just what old people say. I thought it was weird because my mom was not raised as a racist, and it shocked her as well. Story 51. My mother's father died when she was a young teenager in a workplace accident when he fell into a press. She was the one who identified his remains as her mother could not be found. She was an only child, and his death fractured the family, leaving her to essentially raise herself from that point onward. About 40 years later, I accompanied her back to say goodbye to her estranged uncle, who was on his deathbed. He told her that he and her father were spies for the government and that her father had been killed in the line of duty, and they had staged the death. They had her identify the body because her mother would have asked too many questions. He may have been senile, but he did seem lucid, and my mother said it would explain a lot of other things. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.